The sun isn't even fully up over the fjord, and a woman is already elbow-deep in raw wool, picking grease and dirt out of it with her fingers before it can even become thread. Across the yard, a man is checking on a granary, a stone-lined chest built to hold 200 kilos of barley, because if that grain spoils, people starve. Raid season or not. No swords today, no longship, just work. So here's the question. What did Vikings actually do on an ordinary Tuesday? You've probably guessed by now. This isn't going to be a video about raiding. That's almost the point. Because for the vast majority of people we call Vikings, a raid might happen once a year, if ever. The other 360-some days, those were filled with something far less cinematic and far more surprising once you see the actual archaeology, a hidden economy of farming, weaving, trading, and law that was arguably more central to Viking identity than the axe ever was. The Viking longhouse wasn't just a house. It was the whole operation. Home, workshop, and barn under one turf roof. Picture the inside. A long central hearth runs down the middle, smoke curling up toward a hole in the roof. Wooden benches line the walls, their seats by day, beds by night. And at one end, separated by nothing more than a low partition, are the animals. Cattle, sheep, sometimes pigs, brought in against the winter cold. You slept a few meters from your own livestock. That wasn't primitive. That was thermal engineering. Animal body heat helped keep the whole structure alive through a Scandinavian winter. Farming dictated the entire calendar. In spring, fields were broken, not with the heavy iron plows used elsewhere in Europe, but with a simpler tool called an ARD, basically a wooden blade that scratches the soil rather than turning it. Barley and rye went in. Through summer, livestock were driven up to higher pastures, a practice called sell, freeing the home fields to grow hay, because hay, not gold, was the resource that determined whether your animals survived the next winter. And this is where the archaeology gets specific. Excavations at a site called Adalstrati, right in the middle of modern Reykjavik, uncovered one of the earliest Viking Age farms in Iceland, and inside it, a stone-built granary chest. If that chest had been full, it would have held around 200 kilos of grain. That's not a decorative detail. That's a family calculating, with real precision, exactly how much food had to be stored to make it to spring. Here's the thing, nobody tells you about that number. 200 kilos sounds like a lot, until you do the math on how many mouths and how many months of frost that grain actually has to cover. Losing that chest to damp or rot or rats wasn't an inconvenience. It was a famine. And unlike a raid, which might go badly for one crew on one voyage, a bad harvest could take down an entire household, parents, children, elders, livestock, all of it, without a single weapon ever being drawn. That's part of why plow technology mattered so little compared to timing. Norse farmers weren't behind the rest of Europe by accident when it came to the heavier iron plow. The Aard simply suited thin, rocky, glacially scraped soil better. Farming here wasn't a lesser version of farming somewhere else. It was a different, deliberately adapted system, tuned over generations to a landscape that would kill you if you got the calendar wrong. So when you picture a Viking, picture this first. Not a raider sharpening an axe, but a farmer walking the tree line at dusk, mentally recalculating whether there's enough hay stacked to get the cattle through to April. That calculation, repeated by tens of thousands of households across Scandinavia, was the actual full-time job. Raiding, for most people, wasn't even on the list. But farming only explains how people survived. It doesn't explain how they got rich. For that, you have to look at something almost nobody associates with Vikings at all: weaving. Here's the reframe. In Viking Age Iceland, cloth wasn't just clothing, it was money. A standardized woolen fabric called vadmal was literally used as currency, to pay taxes, to settle debts, to buy imported goods from merchants who'd never set foot on a farm. There were even legal standards for how tightly it had to be woven to count as valid payment. A single cow, by the record, cost about 120 ells of this cloth. Wool wasn't a byproduct of farm life. It was the exchange rate. And the person producing that currency, almost without exception, was a woman, spinning raw wool into yarn, then weaving it on an upright loom weighted with stone or clay discs, was skilled, specialized labor, and it was hers. Marriage contracts in the sagas even priced a bride partly on how much cloth she could produce in a year. That's not a footnote about domestic life. That's an economy running on female labor, in a society that gets remembered almost entirely for its men. Now, here's the mini-loop, because this next number is the one that should stop you. A single Viking ship's sail could measure roughly 50 by 30 yards of woven wool. Textile researchers estimate it took one woman about 3 years of full-time weaving to produce a sail that size. And that's after the wool was already cleaned and spun. Every longship that crossed open ocean was, quite literally, wearing years of a woman's labor. And this isn't old news being recycled. In 2026, archaeologists excavating a site called Suften near modern Aarhus uncovered a textile production complex spanning roughly 100,000 square meters, with more than 80 separate workshop structures. Spindle whirls, loom weights, flax processing tools, all in one place. This wasn't a farm wife spinning wool by the fire in her spare hours. This was organized, large-scale, borderline industrial cloth production, feeding directly into trade networks and elite households. So the next time you picture a longship crashing onto a foreign beach, picture the other half of that story first. A workshop full of women, months from the coast, producing the exact fabric that made the voyage physically possible in the first place. Without that labor, there is no ship, there is no raid. There's just a very well-armed man standing on a beach he can't leave. We'll come back to the raiding question in a moment. But first, there's a third full-time economy running in parallel. And it depended on the exact opposite of violence. Towns like Birka, founded around 750 AD on a small island in Sweden's Lake Mälaren, weren't military outposts. They were marketplaces. Walk through Birka in its prime, and you'd pass rows of timber workshops backing onto the docks, comb makers cutting antler into fine-toothed combs, blacksmiths hammering out tools, weavers, potters, bead makers, all working side by side. Archaeologists have pulled Arabic silver coins out of the ground there, alongside glass beakers from the Frankish Empire, and beads that originated as far away as India. What did the locals trade for all of that? Not stolen gold, iron, furs, antler, ordinary goods, produced by ordinary labor, moving through a trade network that stretched from the Islamic world to Scandinavia. There's even evidence Birka ran both summer and winter markets. Traders hauling furs in over the frozen lake on skates and sleds when the water was too solid to sail. A trading town like Birka only works if it's safe. Merchants won't sail Arabic silver into a harbor that might get torched by the same people they're trying to trade with. So the towns that made the Viking Age economically explosive, the ones bringing in the silver, the silk, the exotic goods sagas love to describe, depended on Vikings being reliable trading partners far more often than they were raiders. That's the contradiction loop worth sitting with. The image of the Viking as a chaos agent, and the reality of the Viking as a craftsman or merchant carefully protecting a profitable trade relationship existed inside the very same culture, often inside the very same person. A man could sail to Dublin one summer to trade combs and furs and never once draw a weapon. So farming fed people. Weaving funded ships and paid the bills. Trade brought in silver. But none of that works without one more piece most people never even think to ask about. How did Vikings stop each other from just taking what they wanted? The answer is the Thing, spelled Thing in Old Norse. And it might be the most underrated Viking institution there is. A Thing was an open-air assembly where free men gathered on a regular schedule to settle disputes, pass laws, and make communal decisions. No king required. No standing army enforcing it. Just a location, a fixed date, and a law speaker whose entire job was to memorize the law in full and recite it aloud from memory so the whole community could hear it and hold each other to it. Picture the scale of that for a second. An entire legal code, held not in a book, but in one person's memory, spoken into the open air once a year at a place like the Lögberg, the Law Rock, in Iceland. If someone was killed, the family didn't necessarily default to a blood feud. They could bring the case to the Thing, where witnesses spoke, the law speaker recited the relevant law, and the assembly rendered a judgment, often a payment called vergild, compensation paid to the victim's family instead of a killing in return. It wasn't perfect, and outlawry, being cast out of society entirely, was treated as a fate worse than death. But it was a real system, built entirely on collective participation rather than centralized power. Iceland's version of this, the Althing, is still recognized today as one of the oldest continuously functioning parliamentary institutions in the world. Every free man could, in theory, speak. That's a strange thing to learn about a culture whose reputation is built almost entirely on violence. The Thing wasn't just a courtroom. It doubled as a marketplace, a place to arrange marriages, and the one moment a year when scattered farms across an entire region turned back into a single community. The same people spinning wool, hauling grain, and hammering combs in Birka were, once a year, standing in a field, listening to their own laws read back to them, and holding each other accountable to them. There's a warning loop worth sitting with here too. None of this worked automatically. A thing only functioned if enough people showed up, respected the law speaker's recitation, and actually paid the weregild instead of reaching for a blade anyway. Sagas are full of moments where that system strained or broke. A family that refused to accept compensation. A feud that reignited despite a ruling. The thing wasn't proof that Viking society was peaceful. It was proof that Viking society knew exactly how easily it could tear itself apart and built an entire yearly institution specifically to stop that from happening. That's the fourth full-time job, being, in a very real sense, your own government. So here's where this has to land, because the contrast is uncomfortable once you actually put it together. We've built an entire cultural image. Horned helmets, dragon ships, the word Viking itself, around maybe a handful of violent days scattered across a person's entire life. Meanwhile, the actual daily reality, the granary calculations, the years spent at a loom, the workshop rows in Birka, the law speaker reciting an entire legal code from memory, barely makes it into the popular version of this story at all, and it's worth asking why. Partly it's the sources. The loudest accounts of the Viking Age were written by the people being raided. Monks recording the worst day of their lives, understandably, in vivid and horrified detail. Nobody wrote a dramatic chronicle titled, "The Day the Vikings Successfully Finished Weaving a Sail." Routine labor doesn't get remembered. Violence does. That's not just a medieval problem, it's a human one. Think about how we talk about entrepreneurs today. The story that gets told is the launch, the funding round, the big public win. What almost never gets told is the unglamorous, repetitive labor underneath it, the 10,000 small, boring decisions that actually built the thing. We do the exact same selective remembering the monks did. We just do it about founders instead of farmers.